Now we shall start with the section 4, context of the organization. When an organization is implementing its QMS, the first step for ISO 9001 requirements is to thoughtfully align business objectives and intent with the QMS. This process is titled as context of the organization. The context includes defining influences of various factors on the organization and how they impact the QMS, the culture of the company, objectives and goals, complexity of products, the flow of processes and information. It also requires a reflection of the size of the organization, its markets, and how they define the customers and other interested parties. It also uses the context as a way to detect risks and opportunities and how it affects the QMS. As per ISO 9000, the definition of context of the organization is business environment, a combination of internal and external factors and conditions. These factors and conditions that can have an effect on an organization's approach to its products, services, and investments and interested parties. The note states that this concept of context of organization is equally applicable to not-for-profit organizations, public service organizations, and governmental organizations. Also, in normal language, this concept is also known as the business environment organizational environment or ecosystem of an organization. The dynamics of the operating environment for organizations has changed a lot over the years with new technological advances, the rise of social media, environmental concerns, and the influence of many such political, social, economic, legal, financial, regulatory, and cultural factors. Similarly, internal factors such as our own skills and competencies, internal organizational structure changes, and culture may require us to plan or change our internal processes to suit the needs of the customer better and to ensure high quality products, services to the customer. These internal and external factors are called context in ISO 9001. ISO 9001 requires that an organization considers all these factors while creating its strategic plans and addresses all kinds of risks and opportunities arising out of these factors to determine the scope of the quality management system, QMS, and its processes. Apart from context, requirements of interested parties and product services offered by an organization shall also be considered while determining the scope of the QMS. An interested party for a small organization may include, but are not limited to, customers, regulatory or government bodies, management, employees, suppliers, etc. The requirement of a customer, for example, can be a high quality product or service and on time delivery. The scope and processes of the QMS shall be defined such that the context requirement of interested parties and types of products, services that organization offer are addressed through its QMS. Today, organizations work in a highly volatile and competitive environment. For any organization, whether big or small, it is essential to identify the contextual issues as these may lead to potential risk or an opportunity. For example, cultural and religious aspects of a region may impact how much a product or service is successful in that region. Without understanding this cultural aspect, if a product is launched in a new area, it runs the risk of low sales. So, identifying context and addressing the risks or opportunity arising out of this context through changed or enhanced processes or planning adequate and timely response to these risks is important for a company. An untimely, inadequate response to these factors may cost a company its reputation and may lead to loss of business. These contextual issues may also present opportunities such as opening up of new markets, availability of new technologies leading to reduced costs. The organization should also be prepared to capture these opportunities at the right time. Context also ensures the QMS works in conjunction with the business's strategic direction. The contextual changes over time shall also be tracked so that the QMS is always in sync with the changes in the internal and external context. With the introduction of this new clause in ISO 9001-2015 version, ISO has bridged the gap and ensured that business context and QMS operate together and are always synchronized. Let's now discuss what the ISO 9001 requirements are under this clause and how this can be implemented in organization. Clause 4 of ISO 9001-2015 has four subclauses, which are 4.1, understanding the organization and its context; 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties; 4.3, determining the scope of the quality management system; 4.4, quality management system and its processes. Let's start with the subclause 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. The subclause 4.1 of ISO 9001-2015 states that the organization must determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and its strategic direction and that affect its ability to achieve the intended result of its quality management system. As per this subclause, the organization must monitor and review information about these external and internal issues. Subclause 4.1 says, under Note 1, that issues can include positive and negative factors or conditions for consideration. Under Note 2, subclause specifies that understanding the external context can be facilitated by considering issues arising from legal, technological, competitive, market, cultural, social, and economic environments, whether international, national, regional, or local. Lastly, under Note 3, the subclause 4.1 of standard states that understanding the internal context can be facilitated by considering issues related to values, culture, knowledge, and performance of the organization. Coming to the subclause 4.2 of ISO 9001-2015, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. This subclause 4.2 of ISO 9001-2015 states that due to their effect or potential effect on the organization's ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, the organization must determine the interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. According to the subclause 4.2, organization must determine the requirements of these interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. Clause also states that the organization must monitor and review information about these interested parties and their relevant requirements. Let me explain this subclause 4.2 in general. An interested party is a person or organization that can be affected by, or recognize themselves to be affected by a decision or activity that's within the scope of the management system. There will be those external interested parties that enforce specific legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements in an organization. There may also be requirements specified by internal interested parties, for example, management and staff, permanent and temporary. The clause 4.2 of ISO 9001-2015 states that the organization must determine relevant interested parties and relevant requirements of appropriate concerned parties. Relevant interested parties to be considered are those that could affect or potentially affect the organization's ability to constantly provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, monitor and review information related to the interested parties and relevant requirements. Firstly, the organization will need to define external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose. That is, what are the relevant issues, both inside and out, that have an influence on what the organization does that would affect its capability to accomplish the intended outcomes of its management system. It should be noted that the term issue covers not only the problems which would have been the subject of the precautionary action in previous standards, but also important topics for the management system to address, such as any market, assurance, and governance goals that the organization might set for its management system. Next, the organization has to determine relevant interested parties and relevant requirements of relevant interested parties. There is no requirement in this international standard for the organization to consider interested parties which have been determined by the organization not to be relevant to its service management system. Similarly, there is no requirement to address a particular requirement of a relevant interested party if the organization considers that the requirement is not relevant. Determining what is relevant or not relevant is reliant on whether or not it has an impact on the organization's ability to provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, or the organization's aim to improve consumer satisfaction. The organization can decide to determine supplementary needs and expectations that will assist it to meet its service objectives. However, it is at the organization's choice whether or not to accept additional requirements to satisfy interested parties beyond what is required by this international standard, ISO 9001-2015. The table 1 on screen explains the types of external interested parties and their possible needs and expectations. Let's talk about the subclause 4.3 determining the scope of the quality management system. The subclause 4.3 of ISO 9001-2015 specifies that the organization must determine the boundaries and applicability of the quality management system to establish its scope. Clause says that when determining this scope, the organization must consider the external and internal issues referred to in subclause 4.1, the requirements of relevant interested parties referred to in subclause 4.2, and the products and services of the organization. The organization must apply all the requirements of this international standard if they are applicable within the determined scope of its quality management system. Covering the mandatory documentation requirements, the subclause 4.3 states that the scope of the organization's quality management system must be available and be maintained as documented information. The scope must state the types of products and services covered and provide justification for any requirement of this international standard that the organization determines is not applicable to the scope of its quality management system. Lastly, subclause 4.3 says that the conformity to this international standard may only be claimed if the requirements determined as not being applicable do not affect the organization's ability or responsibility to ensure the conformity of its products and services and the enhancement of customer satisfaction. Coming to subclause 4.4, quality management system and its processes now. This subclause 4.4.1 of ISO 9001-2015 specifies that the organization must establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve a quality management system, including the processes needed and their interactions, in accordance with the requirements of this international standard. As per the clause, the organization must determine the processes needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization. This clause 4.4.1 states that the organization must determine the inputs required and the outputs expected from these processes. Organization must also determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. To meet the requirements of this standard, subclause 4.4.1 says that organization must determine and apply the criteria and methods needed to ensure the effective operation and control of these processes. The methods to ensure the effective operation includes monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators. According to this subclause, organization must determine the resources needed for these processes and ensure their availability, and must assign the responsibilities and authorities for these processes. Subclause 4.4.1 of ISO 9001-2015 states that the organization must address the risks and opportunities as determined in accordance with the requirements of subclause 6.1 and must evaluate these processes and implement any changes needed to ensure that these processes achieve their intended results. Lastly, the subclause 4.4.1 states that the organization must improve their processes and the quality management system to meet the requirements of the standard. Coming to the subclause 4.4.2. This subclause 4.4.2 states that to the extent necessary, the organization must maintain documented information to support the operation of its processes and must retain documented information to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. Friends, till now it was about the clause 4 of ISO 9001-2015. I sincerely thank you all for your interest and attention. Thank you and best wishes.